A black beggar woman was on the street when a rich man invited her to his ex-wife's wedding. When she speaks at the wedding, the New York afternoon sun cast long shadows over the busy streets of Manhattan as Ethan Blackwood walked aimlessly, his Armani suit contrasting with the somber expression on his face. His steps took him away from the glittering skyscrapers and luxury boutiques towards a less glamorous part of the city. The invitation to his ex-fiancée Claire's wedding weighed heavily in his pocket as a constant reminder of his pain and resentment. Ethan could feel the bitterness growing in his chest, mixed with a fierce determination to prove that he had moved on, even if it was just a facade. As he walked, his eyes caught an unusual movement. A woman, clearly homeless, was sitting on a park bench, reading a battered book. What caught Ethan's eye was not her disheveled appearance, but the dignity with which she carried herself and the glint of intelligence in her eyes. Impulsively, Ethan approached. "Excuse me," he said, his voice hesitant. The woman raised her eyes, revealing a face that, despite the marks of time and hardship, still retained an ethereal beauty. "Yes?" she replied, her voice surprisingly melodious. "My name is Ethan Blackwood," he introduced himself, feeling strangely nervous. "I have a proposition for you." The woman arched an eyebrow, a mixture of curiosity and caution in her gaze. "I'm Maggie," she said simply. "What kind of proposition?" Ethan hesitated, suddenly aware of the absurdity of his idea. But the image of Clara, radiant in her wedding dress next to another man, spurred him on. "I'd like to hire you to be my date for an event," he explained, the words coming out in a rush. "A wedding, to be more specific. My ex-fiancée's wedding." Maggie slowly closed the book, her eyes never leaving Ethan's face. "And why would you want to take a homeless woman as a date to your ex-fiancée's wedding?" she asked, her voice laced with skepticism. Ethan felt warmth creep up his neck. "To make an impression," he admitted, "to show that I've moved on." A wry smile played on Maggie's lips. "Ah, revenge. The noblest motive of all," she commented sarcastically. Ethan felt embarrassed but continued. "I'll pay you well. Enough for you to start a new life if you want." Maggie studied him for a long moment, her piercing eyes seeming to read his soul. "And what exactly would this new life involve?" "A complete makeover," Ethan explained, gaining confidence as he spoke. "New clothes, a new look, etiquette lessons if necessary. You'd be transformed into a sophisticated socialite for a few weeks." Maggie let out a bitter laugh. "Do you think you can turn me into a modern-day Cinderella with the snap of your fingers?" "No," Ethan replied, surprising himself with his sincerity. "I think you already have something special, something that can't be bought or taught. I just want to give you the opportunity to show it." A silence stretched between them, filled only by the distant sounds of traffic and the rustling of leaves in the park's trees. Maggie seemed to be fighting an internal battle, her eyes revealing a whirlwind of emotions. Finally, she spoke. "Why me? Of all the people in this city, why choose a homeless person?" Ethan hesitated, searching for the right words. "Because you have dignity," he finally said. "You're sitting here, reading, what is this, Shakespeare?" Maggie nodded, a slight blush tinging her cheeks. "You have a strength that I admire," Ethan continued. "And frankly, because you have nothing to lose and everything to gain." Maggie considered his words for a moment. "And if I say no?" "Then I'll wish you luck and be on my way," Ethan replied honestly. "But I hope you say yes." Maggie closed her eyes for a moment as if gathering her courage. When she opened them again, there was a fierce determination in her gaze. "All right, Mr. Blackwood, I accept your proposal." Ethan felt a mixture of relief and excitement. "Good," he said, holding out his hand. "Shall we get started?" Maggie hesitated for a moment before taking his hand. Her touch was surprisingly warm and firm. "Before we go," she said, "there's something you need to know. I wasn't always homeless. I had a life, a career, and I lost it all." Ethan felt a knot forming in his throat. "I'm sorry," he said softly. "Don't be," Maggie replied, a glint of defiance in her eyes. "Just understand that I'm not a charity project or a pawn in your revenge game. I'm a person with a history and dignity of my own." Ethan nodded, feeling a growing respect for this enigmatic woman. "I understand," he said, "and I promise to respect that." As they left the park together, Ethan couldn't help feeling that he was embarking on something much bigger than simple revenge, something that could change his life forever. The sun was beginning to set, casting a golden glow over the city. The shadows lengthened, but for the first time in months, Ethan felt a spark of hope ignite in his chest. He looked at Maggie, who was walking with her head held high, her Shakespeare book clutched tightly against her chest. "So," he said, breaking the silence, "where do we start?" Maggie looked at him, an enigmatic smile playing on her lips. "At the beginning, Mr. Blackwood. Always at the beginning." And so, under the velvety New York sky, an unlikely partnership was born, ready to challenge convention and shake the foundations of high society. The game had begun, and neither of them could have foreseen the twists and turns that awaited them. The morning sun filtered through the silk curtains of Ethan's penthouse apartment, casting a golden glow over Maggie, who was sleeping soundly in one of the guest bedrooms. Her eyes opened slowly, disoriented by the luxurious softness of the Egyptian sheets and the almost palpable silence that surrounded her. For a moment, she thought she was dreaming. The cream-colored walls, the elegant furniture, and the breathtaking view of Manhattan seemed to belong to another world, a world from which she had been exiled long ago. A soft knock on the door brought her back to reality. "Maggie?" Ethan's voice sounded from the other side. "Are you awake? We've got a busy day ahead of us." Maggie sat up, running her fingers through her tangled hair. "I'm awake," she replied, her voice still hoarse with sleep. When she opened the door, Ethan was there, impeccably dressed in a navy blue suit. His eyes widened slightly at the sight of her, as if he were seeing her for the first time. "Good morning," he said, a slight blush tinging his cheeks. "Breakfast is ready, then we'll start your transformation." Maggie nodded, following him into the kitchen. The aroma of fresh coffee and freshly baked croissants filled her senses, making her stomach rumble audibly. "Please help yourself," Ethan gestured to the bountiful table. "We need you well fed for the day ahead." As they ate, Ethan explained the itinerary, a visit to the beauty salon, followed by a shopping spree in the city's most exclusive boutiques. Maggie listened in silence, a mixture of anxiety and excitement bubbling in her chest. "Ethan," she finally said, placing her coffee cup on the table, "why are you doing this? Really?" Ethan paused, his eyes meeting hers. "Honestly, at first it was about revenge, but now, I'm not sure. Maybe it's a chance to do something good, to help someone." Maggie studied him for a moment, looking for signs of falsity, but finding only surprising vulnerability. "You know this isn't going to fill the void Clara left, don't you?" Ethan lowered his gaze, a sad smile playing on his lips. "Maybe it won't, but maybe it can be the start of something new. For both of us." The day passed in a whirlwind of activity. In the beauty salon, Maggie watched in fascination as her reflection in the mirror was transformed. Her hair, once dull and lifeless, took on a silky shine and an elegant cut that perfectly framed her face. Her nails, previously broken and battered, were carefully manicured. In the haute couture boutique, Maggie found herself surrounded by luxurious fabrics and sophisticated designs. Each dress she tried on seemed to reveal a new facet of her personality, a version of herself she had forgotten existed. "You look beautiful," Ethan murmured, his eyes shining with admiration as she emerged from the fitting room wearing an emerald green evening dress. Maggie felt a blush creep up her neck. "Thank you," she said softly, surprising herself with the emotion in her own voice. As the day progressed, Ethan began to notice something intriguing about Maggie. Not only was she adapting quickly to her new appearance, but she also displayed a surprising knowledge of fashion, art, and social etiquette. "You seem quite familiar with all this," he commented as they ate lunch in an exclusive restaurant. Maggie froze for a moment, her fork hanging in the air. "I wasn't always homeless, Ethan," she finally said, her voice laden with a sadness he hadn't noticed before. "There was a time when I belonged to this world." Ethan leaned forward, his curiosity piqued. "What happened?" Maggie put down her fork, her eyes straying into a distant memory. "I was a successful executive. I had everything: money, status, a bright future ahead of me. But then," she paused, swallowing. "There was a scandal, a corporate conspiracy. I was used as a scapegoat. I lost everything: my career, my reputation, my life." Ethan felt a knot forming in his throat. "I'm sorry," he said softly, reaching out to touch her hand. Maggie withdrew her hand gently, a sad smile on her lips. "Don't be. It was a long time ago. I've learned a lot since then, about what really matters in life." The rest of the day passed in a blur of etiquette lessons and rehearsals for the big event. Ethan watched, fascinated, as Maggie absorbed each new piece of information with an ease that bordered on the supernatural. In the evening, back at the apartment, Ethan found Maggie on the balcony, looking out at the city lights. She was stunning in her new look, but there was a melancholy in her eyes that touched him deeply. "Are you all right?" he asked, joining her. Maggie turned to him, an enigmatic smile on her lips. "I'm remembering who I used to be," she said softly, "and wondering who I am now." Ethan felt a wave of emotion wash over him. "You're extraordinary," he said, surprised at the sincerity in his own voice. "No matter what you wear or what you look like." Maggie studied him for a long moment, her eyes shining with something he couldn't decipher. "Thank you, Ethan," she finally said, "for giving me this chance, not just to transform myself on the outside, but to rediscover who I am on the inside." As they stood there side by side, looking out over the city that never sleeps, Ethan felt something change inside him. What had started out as a plan for revenge was turning into something deeper, more meaningful, and for the first time in a long time, he felt truly alive. Night fell over New York, enveloping the city in a blanket of stars and twinkling lights. On Ethan's rooftop, two lonely souls found a moment of connection, a silent promise of something more to come. Maggie's transformation was just beginning, and with it, Ethan's transformation too. The ballroom of the Plaza Hotel sparkled under the light of hundreds of Swarovski crystals, reflecting the glitter of the jewels and the glamour of the gala dresses. It was the night of the Blackwood Foundation's annual charity ball, an event that brought together the cream of New York society. The air was charged with expensive perfumes and even more valuable expectations. Ethan adjusted his bow tie, feeling a mixture of anxiety and excitement. Next to him, Maggie took a deep breath, her fingers lightly squeezing the diamond clutch that matched her sapphire blue silk dress. "Are you ready?" Ethan asked, offering his arm. Maggie nodded, a confident smile on her crimson lips. "Born ready," she replied, entwining her arm in his. The double doors opened, and all eyes turned to the newly arrived couple. Ethan felt a surge of pride when he saw the expressions of surprise and admiration on the faces around them. Maggie, for her part, maintained a graceful posture, as if she had been born for this moment. "Ethan, darling!" A shrill voice cut through the murmur of the crowd. Vivian Blackwood, Ethan's mother, approached, her blue eyes appraising Maggie from top to toe. "Who's your lovely date?" "Mom, this is Maggie," Ethan introduced, noticing Maggie's slight grip on his arm. "Maggie, my mother, Vivian Blackwood." "It's a pleasure to meet you, Mrs. Blackwood," Maggie said, her voice soft and melodious. "Your son has been a wonderful host." Vivian arched a perfectly drawn eyebrow. "I imagine so," she murmured, her tone making it clear that she had her suspicions about the nature of their relationship. Ethan has always had a peculiar taste for company. Before Ethan could reply, a familiar figure emerged from the crowd. Clara, his ex-fiancée, looked stunning in a red dress that hugged her curves. Next to her, her fiancé James looked uncomfortable in his tuxedo. "Ethan," Clara greeted, her eyes widening slightly at the sight of Maggie. "What a pleasant surprise." "Clara," Ethan replied, feeling a familiar knot forming in his stomach. "You look as beautiful as ever. Allow me to introduce Maggie." Clara held out her hand, a forced smile on her lips. "Charmed," she said, her voice betraying a hint of jealousy. "I don't think we've met before. Are you new in town?" Maggie smiled, accepting the handshake with grace. "Actually, I'm an old acquaintance from New York," she replied softly. "I've just been absent for a while." Clara frowned, clearly puzzled. "Oh? And what circles did you used to move in?" "The same as you, I imagine," Maggie replied with a twinkle in her eye. "Although I've discovered that there's a lot more to life than parties and gossip." A tense silence fell over the group. Ethan felt a mixture of pride and apprehension at seeing Maggie confront Clara so elegantly. "Well," Clara finally said, her voice tense, "I hope you enjoy the party. If you'll excuse us." As Clara walked away, dragging a confused James with her, Ethan couldn't help but notice the look of admiration her ex-fiancée cast at Maggie. As the evening progressed, Maggie continued to surprise Ethan. She navigated the conversations with ease, discussing art with a renowned curator, debating politics with a senator, and even exchanging jokes in French with a foreign diplomat. "Where did you learn all this?" Ethan asked during a quiet moment, genuinely impressed. Maggie smiled, a hint of sadness in her eyes. "A lifetime of experiences, Ethan. Some good, some not so good, but all valuable." As they danced a waltz, Ethan felt more and more intrigued by this enigmatic woman in his arms. She was much more than just an escort to make him jealous. Maggie was a mystery he longed to unravel. "You're doing incredibly well," he murmured, leading her through the hall. "Thank you," she replied, her eyes shining. "But remember, Ethan, this is just a role I'm playing. Don't fall for the illusion." Her words hit him with unexpected force. Ethan realized, with a mixture of surprise and concern, that he was already taking that risk. Across the hall, Clara watched the couple with a mixture of jealousy and fascination. She turned to James, who was engaged in a conversation about golf. "Who is she really?" Clara asked, more to herself than to her fiancé. "And why does Ethan seem so different with her?" James followed Clara's gaze, frowning. "Maybe he's finally moved on," he suggested, a touch of irritation in his voice. "Just as you should." Clara ignored the comment, her eyes fixed on Ethan and Maggie. There was something about the way they moved together, as if they shared a secret that no one else knew. As the evening progressed, the whispers about Ethan Blackwood's mysterious companion grew. Who was she? Where had she come from? How had she won the heart of New York's most sought-after bachelor? Maggie, for her part, felt the weight of the stares and expectations. Every smile, every graceful gesture was a reminder of who she used to be and everything she had lost. But there was also a growing sense of empowerment, a rediscovery of her own strength. When the party finally came to an end, Ethan and Maggie left the Plaza Hotel under a shower of camera flashes and excited whispers. In the comfort of the limousine, Maggie finally relaxed, letting out a long, shaky sigh. "You were amazing," Ethan said softly, taking her hand. "Thank you for tonight." Maggie looked up at him, her eyes shining with unspoken emotion. "Thank you for giving me this opportunity, Ethan. For a moment, I felt alive again." The silence that followed was full of unspoken possibilities. As the limousine glided through the streets of New York, Ethan found himself questioning his original motives. What had started out as a revenge plot was turning into something much deeper and more meaningful. Back at the apartment, Maggie stood on the balcony, looking out at the city lights. Ethan joined her, feeling a connection that went beyond their initial agreement. "What happens now?" Maggie asked softly, her voice almost lost in the night wind. Ethan looked at her, seeing not only the stunning woman from the party, but also the complex and fascinating person he was getting to know. "Now," he replied, "we move on. There are more events, more opportunities for you to shine. And maybe we'll discover more about ourselves in the process." Maggie nodded, a small smile playing on her lips. "Sounds like a dangerous plan, Mr. Blackwood." "The best-laid plans usually are," Ethan replied with a smile. As the night deepened, Ethan and Maggie stood on the balcony, two strangers brought together by unusual circumstances, on the brink of a journey that promised to transform them both in ways neither of them could have foreseen. The morning sun seeped through the curtains of Ethan's apartment, finding Maggie sitting on the balcony, a steaming cup of coffee between her hands. Her eyes, still sleepy, scanned the headlines of the newspaper spread out on the glass table. Suddenly she froze. Her face paled and the cup shook in her hands, spilling a few drops of coffee onto the paper. "It can't be," she muttered, her fingers tracing the lines of the article with disbelief. That's how Ethan found her, minutes later. "Maggie, is everything all right?" She looked up, a mixture of shock and pain in her eyes. "Ethan," she said, her voice shaking, "we need to talk." He sat down next to her, the concern evident on his face. "What happened?" Maggie pushed the newspaper towards him. "Read this." The article talked about an ongoing investigation into a corporate scandal from years ago. One name stood out: Blackwood Enterprises. "I don't understand," Ethan said, frowning. "What does this have to do with you?" Maggie took a deep breath, closing her eyes for a moment. When she opened them again, they were filled with a fierce determination. "Remember when I said that I lost everything because of a corporate scandal? This was it, and your company, Ethan, was at the center of it all." The shock hit Ethan like a punch in the gut. "What? But how?" "I was CFO of Global Tech at the time," Maggie explained, her voice gaining strength as she spoke. "I discovered irregularities in the accounts, a conspiracy involving several companies. When I tried to expose the truth, I was silenced. I lost my job, my reputation, everything." Ethan shook his head in disbelief. "No, there must be some mistake. My father never—" "Your father may not have known," Maggie interrupted gently, "but someone at Blackwood Enterprises was involved, and I paid the price." The silence that followed was heavy with unspoken revelations and turbulent emotions. Ethan stood up abruptly, pacing back and forth on the balcony. "Why didn't you tell me before?" he finally asked, his voice tense. Maggie looked at him sadly. "At first, I didn't know who you were, and then, well, Things got complicated. Ethan stopped, staring at her. How complicated? Like the fact that I was starting to care about you, Maggie admitted softly. In a way I didn't expect. Ethan's heart leapt, but confusion and guilt kept him at bay. I need to find out the truth, he finally said. If my family had any involvement in this, I need to know. Maggie nodded, standing up. I understand. But Ethan, be prepared. The truth isn't always easy to accept. In the hours that followed, Ethan plunged into a frantic investigation. Calls were made, old files unearthed, favors called in. Maggie watched from a distance, her heart heavy with the guilt of having brought this storm into Ethan's life. As the pieces of the puzzle began to fall into place, Ethan's expression became more and more somber. Finally, he hung up the phone and turned to Maggie, his face a mask of heartbreak and betrayal. You were right, he said, his voice hoarse. My father, he knew. Maybe he wasn't the architect, but he allowed it to happen. He turned a blind eye to the corruption for the sake of profits. Maggie approached him, hesitantly. Ethan, I'm sorry. I never wanted to. No, he interrupted her, holding up a hand. Don't apologize. You didn't do anything wrong. I'm the one who owes you an apology for everything you've been through, for the part my family played in it. She touched his arm gently. You're not responsible for your father's mistakes, Ethan. Maybe not, he agreed, but I am responsible for correcting them. At that moment, something changed between them. What had started out as an agreement of convenience, a sham for society, had turned into something deeper, truer. What are you going to do now? Maggie asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Ethan looked at her, his eyes shining with a mixture of determination and vulnerability. I'm going to expose the truth, no matter what the cost. But Maggie, I can't ask you to stand by me in this battle. You've suffered enough for my family. Maggie stepped forward, taking Ethan's hands between hers. You don't have to ask, she said firmly. I choose to stay, not just for justice, but for you, for what we've built together. The look they exchanged was charged with emotion, years of pain and hope intertwining in a moment of mutual understanding. In the weeks that followed, Ethan and Maggie worked tirelessly to gather evidence, to build a solid case against those responsible for the scandal. Each new discovery brought them closer together, forging a bond that went beyond their initial farce. One evening, exhausted after hours of work, they found themselves on the balcony, looking out at the city lights. Ethan turned to Maggie, his eyes shining with an emotion he could no longer contain. Maggie, he began, his voice trembling. I know we started this as a game, a lie, but what I feel for you now is the truest thing I've ever experienced. Maggie felt her heart race. Ethan, Before she could finish, Ethan's phone rang, interrupting the moment. It was his lawyer with urgent news about the case. While Ethan took the call, Maggie watched his profile against the New York night sky. She knew they were on the verge of something monumental, not just in terms of justice, but in their personal lives. The road ahead would be difficult, full of obstacles and broken hearts. But there, on that balcony, with the city at her feet and the truth finally coming to light, Maggie felt a spark of hope. A hope not just for justice, but for a fresh start, a chance to rebuild her life alongside someone who saw her for who she really was. When Ethan hung up the phone and turned to her, their eyes met. No words were necessary. They knew that whatever the future held, they would face it together. The night deepened around them, the city pulsing with life and possibilities. And there, in the heart of Manhattan, two wounded souls found comfort in each other, ready to face the storms to come, side by side. Clara's reflection in the mirror looked strange, almost unrecognizable. Her eyes, normally bright and confident, were clouded with doubt and uncertainty. She adjusted her wedding dress for the umpteenth time, looking for non-existent imperfections. "You look beautiful, dear," her mother said, entering the room with a forced smile. "James will be delighted." Clara nodded mechanically, but her heart wasn't in it. Her thoughts wandered back to the night of the charity ball, to the look she had seen in Ethan's eyes when he danced with Maggie. It was a look she knew well, the same one he used to give her. "Mom," Clara began hesitantly, "have you ever wondered if you're doing the right thing, even when everything looks perfect on the outside?" Clara's mother froze for a moment, her smile faltering. "Honey, it's just pre-wedding jitters. It's perfectly normal." But Clara knew it was more than that. The last few weeks had been a whirlwind of mixed emotions. Every time she saw Ethan and Maggie together, at social events, in gossip columns, even in her restless dreams, she felt a pang of, what? Jealousy? Regret? "I need some air," Clara muttered, hurrying out of the room. She wandered through the mansion's gardens, her wedding dress dragging on the grass damp from the morning dew. The wedding was scheduled for the following day, and all of New York was eagerly awaiting the social event of the year. Everyone, that is, except the bride. Clara found herself standing in front of the ancient oak tree where Ethan had proposed to her almost 2 years ago. Memories flooded her mind, his nervousness, the sparkle of the ring, the feeling that the whole world was opening up before them. "What's changed?" she wondered aloud. Perhaps the question is, what hasn't changed? A familiar voice replied. Clara turned around in surprise to find Maggie standing a few meters away. She looked simple but elegant in a light blue dress that highlighted her eyes. "Maggie," Clara said, her voice a mixture of surprise and caution, "what are you doing here?" Maggie stepped forward, her face a mask of calm determination. "I came to talk to you, Clara. About Ethan, about you, about everything." Clara felt her heart racing. "There's nothing to talk about. I'm getting married tomorrow." "Are you?" Maggie asked softly. "Because you don't look like a happy bride." The words hit Clara like a slap. She felt tears forming in her eyes, but bravely held them back. "You don't know anything about me." "I know more than you realize," Maggie replied, her voice gentle but firm. "I know that you still love Ethan, and I know that he still cares about you." Clara shook her head, confused. "Then why are you here? Why aren't you fighting for him?" Maggie smiled sadly. "Because it's not about me, Clara. It's about the two of you facing the truth you've been avoiding for so long." The two women stared at each other for a long moment, the air between them charged with unspoken emotions. Finally, Clara collapsed on a nearby bench, the tears finally escaping. "I don't know what to do," she admitted, her voice breaking. "I love James, I really do. But Ethan, he'll always be my first love." Maggie sat down next to her, placing a comforting hand on her shoulder. "First love is powerful, Clara, but it's not always the right love." Clara looked up, surprised by the compassion in Maggie's voice. "How can you be so understanding? I thought you hated me." Maggie shook her head, a sad smile on her lips. "Hate only breeds more hate, Clara, and we've all suffered enough." At that moment, Clara saw Maggie not as a rival, but as someone who understood her pain, who had been through her own trials. "What happened to you, Maggie?" Clara asked softly. "How did you end up, well, you know?" Maggie took a deep breath, her eyes straying into distant memories. "It's a long story, Clara. A story of betrayal, loss, and, eventually, redemption. But we're not here to talk about me. We're here for you." Clara nodded, feeling an unexpected connection with this woman who was supposed to be her enemy. "What should I do?" Be honest with yourself, Maggie replied. And with James, he deserves to know the truth, whatever it is. Maggie's words echoed in Clara's mind, mingling with her own doubts and fears. She stood up abruptly, a new determination in her eyes. I need to talk to Ethan, she said, before it's too late. Maggie nodded, a mixture of sadness and understanding in her gaze. Do what you need to do, Clara, but remember, sometimes letting go is the greatest act of love. Clara looked at Maggie one last time, gratitude in her eyes. Thank you, she whispered, before turning and running back to the mansion. Maggie stood there watching Clara disappear into the distance. Her heart was heavy, but she knew she had done the right thing. Love, she had learned, was not about possession, but about freedom. Meanwhile, in his Manhattan apartment, Ethan was immersed in papers and documents, still working tirelessly to unravel the scandal that had ruined Maggie's life. He barely noticed when the door opened and Clara walked in, still in her wedding dress. Ethan, she called softly. He looked up, shocked to see her there. Clara? What's going on? Clara stepped forward, tears shining in her eyes. We need to talk, Ethan, about us, about the past, about the future. Ethan stood up slowly, his heart beating fast. He knew that this moment would change everything, forever. Clara, he began, his voice trembling, But before he could continue, the phone rang, interrupting the moment. It was his lawyer with urgent news about the case. Ethan looked at Clara from the phone, torn between the past and the present, between the love he once felt and the mission that now consumed him. Clara saw the hesitation in his eyes and understood. With a sad smile, she nodded. Pick up, she said softly. Some things are bigger than both of us. As Ethan answered the call, Clara watched the man she once thought she knew so well. She saw the passion in his eyes, the determination in his posture, and knew in that moment that the Ethan she had loved no longer existed. He had become someone new, someone with a greater purpose. With a heavy heart, but strangely at peace, Clara turned to leave. She knew now what she needed to do. As night fell over New York, 3 tormented souls faced their truths. Clara, about to make the hardest choice of her life. Ethan, torn between the past and the future. And Maggie, watching from afar, her heart broken but her conscience clear. Fate had intertwined their lives in unexpected ways. And now, on the eve of a wedding that might never happen, the future was full of possibilities and uncertainties. The ballroom of the Ritz-Carlton Hotel flickered under the soft light of hundreds of candles, the murmur of conversation mingling with the soft notes of a string quartet. It was the night of the rehearsal dinner for Clara's wedding, an event that should have been filled with joy and anticipation. However, the air was charged with unspoken tension and secrets about to be revealed. Ethan nervously adjusted his bow tie, his eyes scanning the room for Maggie. She was radiant in an emerald green dress, chatting animatedly with a group of guests. For a moment, their gazes met, and Ethan felt his heart leap. How things had changed in such a short time. Across the hall, Clara watched the scene with a mixture of sadness and resignation. Her white cocktail dress seemed to weigh tons, a constant reminder of the future she was no longer sure she wanted. "Are you all right, darling?" James asked, placing a gentle hand on her back. Clara forced a smile. "Yes, just a bit nervous." But before James could reply, a buzz spread through the hall. Theodore Blackwood, Ethan's father, had arrived, and the expression on his face was one of pure fury. "Ethan," he thundered, crossing the hall with determined strides. "What the hell do you think you're doing?" Silence fell over the crowd, all eyes on the imminent confrontation between father and son. Ethan straightened up, his expression a mixture of determination and sadness. "Doing the right thing, Dad. Something we should have done a long time ago." Theodore grabbed Ethan's arm, pulling him close. Do you have any idea what's at stake? What this will do to our family, to the company? And do you have any idea how many lives have been destroyed by our greed? Ethan retorted, his voice low but firm. Maggie watched the scene unfold, her heart beating fast. She knew that this was a crucial moment, not just for Ethan, but for everyone involved in the scandal that had ruined his life. Clara, sensing the gravity of the situation, hesitantly approached. "What's going on?" she asked, looking from Ethan to Theodore. It was Maggie who answered, her voice calm but charged with emotion. "The truth, Clara. The truth that's been hidden for so long." And then, in front of all the astonished guests, Maggie began to tell her story. The story of a brilliant young executive whose career and life were destroyed by a corporate scandal orchestrated by the most powerful. The story of betrayal, greed, and lives ruined in the name of profit. As Maggie spoke, Theodore's face paled. Clara put her hands to her mouth in horror. James, who had been watching in silence until then, stepped forward. "Is it true?" he asked, looking directly at Theodore. "Did Blackwood Enterprises really do this?" Theodore opened his mouth to reply, but Ethan interrupted him. "Yes, it's true, and I have the proof." A shocked murmur ran through the room. Friends, family, and business colleagues looked at each other in disbelief. "You can't do this, Ethan!" Theodore hissed. "You'll destroy everything we've built." "No, Dad," Ethan replied, his voice firm. "I'm saving what's left of our integrity." At that moment, Clara stepped forward, her eyes shining with a mixture of admiration and sadness. "Ethan," she said softly, "I understand now. I understand why you changed, why we couldn't be together anymore." Ethan looked at her, feeling a wave of gratitude and affection. "Clara, But before he could continue, Theodore, in a final act of desperation, grabbed a glass of champagne and threw it in Maggie's direction. "You tramp! You've ruined everything!" Time seemed to slow down. Ethan moved instinctively to protect Maggie, but it was Clara who arrived first, placing herself between Maggie and the flying liquid. The champagne hit Clara's white dress, staining it irreparably. A stunned silence fell over the room. "Enough!" James's voice thundered, startling everyone. "Mr. Blackwood, I think you'd better leave. Now." Security guards appeared almost instantly, escorting a furious Theodore out of the hall. In the chaos that followed, Ethan found himself at the center of a maelstrom of emotions. He looked at Clara, who smiled sadly as James wrapped her in a protective embrace. He looked at Maggie, whose eyes shone with a mixture of gratitude and love. "Ethan," Maggie said softly, touching his arm, "you have a choice to make." And at that moment, in front of everyone he knew and loved, Ethan Blackwood made his choice. He turned to Clara and James, his heart heavy but at peace. "Clara," he began, "you will always be an important part of my life, but—" Clara nodded, understanding. "I know, Ethan. Your heart belongs to someone else now." Ethan then turned to Maggie, taking her hands in his. "Maggie, you showed me what really matters in life. Courage, integrity, true love. I love you, and I want to spend the rest of my life trying to be worthy of your love." Tears glistened in Maggie's eyes as she smiled. "I love you too, Ethan, with all your faults and virtues." The hall, which moments before had been in chaos, was now silent, all eyes fixed on the couple. It was Clara who broke the silence, her voice strained but sincere. "Be happy, you two," she said, a genuine smile lighting up her face. "You deserve it." James nodded in agreement, pulling Clara closer. "And as for us," he whispered in her ear, "how about we make a fresh start? No pressure, no expectations, just the two of us." Clara looked at him, seeing him truly for the first time in months. "I'd love that," she replied softly. As the evening progressed, the mood in the room changed. What had begun as a rehearsal dinner for a wedding turned into a celebration of truth, courage, and new beginnings. Ethan and Maggie danced slowly in the center of the ballroom, lost in each other's eyes. Clara and James talked intimately in a corner, rediscovering the love that had brought them together in the first place. And so, on a night that should have been the prelude to a wedding, new stories of love, redemption, and hope were born. The scandal that had destroyed so many lives would now be exposed, and with it, the chance for healing and justice. As soft music filled the air, Ethan held Maggie closer, feeling as if she had finally found her place in the world. "Thank you," he whispered in her ear. "For what?" Maggie asked, looking at him curiously. "For showing me the way back to myself," Ethan replied, his eyes shining with love and gratitude. Maggie smiled, resting her head on his shoulder. "We're just getting started, Ethan," she murmured. "We have a long journey ahead of us." And so, under the soft lights of the ballroom, two souls who had been broken by the world found healing and purpose in each other. The future was uncertain, full of challenges and obstacles, but together, they were ready to face it. The night that should have been the end of one story became the beginning of another, much more beautiful and true. And while New York City sparkled outside, inside the Ritz-Carlton love, in all its complex and wonderful forms, triumphed. The sun was rising over Manhattan, its golden rays sliding through the windows of Ethan's apartment. Maggie was sitting on the balcony, a steaming cup of coffee between her hands, her eyes lost in the horizon. The last few weeks had been a roller coaster of emotions, and now, in the quiet of the morning, she allowed herself a moment of reflection. Ethan appeared at the balcony door, his face marked by tiredness, but his eyes shining with a fierce determination. "Good morning," he said softly, joining her. Maggie smiled, handing him a cup of coffee. "Morning. Ready for today?" Ethan nodded, taking a sip of his coffee. "As ready as I can be to stand up to my own father and expose decades of corporate corruption." Silence fell between them, heavy with the weight of what was to come. Finally, Maggie spoke, her voice barely above a whisper. "Ethan, there's something you need to know, something I found out last night." Ethan turned to her, concern evident on his face. "What is it?" Maggie took a deep breath, gathering her courage. "It wasn't just your father involved in the scandal. It was a much bigger conspiracy, involving some of the most powerful executives in the country. And—" she hesitated, her eyes filling with tears. "My downfall was orchestrated by someone very close to me, someone I trusted completely." Ethan felt his heart squeeze. "Who?" "My mentor, Robert Sinclair," Maggie replied, her voice trembling. "The man who trained me, who made me believe that I could change the corporate world for the better. He was at the center of it all." The revelation hit Ethan like a punch in the gut. He knew Robert Sinclair, a titan of industry, respected and admired by all. The idea that he could be behind something so nefarious was almost inconceivable. "Maggie, I'm sorry," Ethan said, pulling her into a tight hug. "But how did you find out about this?" Maggie pulled away gently, her eyes shining with a mixture of pain and determination. "I spent all night going through the files we got. There's a pattern, Ethan, a pattern that only someone at the top could orchestrate." Ethan nodded slowly, the pieces of the puzzle falling into place in his mind. "That changes everything," he murmured. "Yes," Maggie agreed, "and that's why we need to be even more careful. Robert has powerful connections, influence at all levels. If we're going to expose the truth, we need to be prepared for the consequences." The rest of the morning passed in a blur of phone calls, emails, and last-minute meetings. Ethan and Maggie worked tirelessly, gathering all the evidence they had collected over the last few weeks. At 2 p.m., they arrived at the imposing Blackwood Enterprises building. The lobby was full of reporters and cameras, all eager for the press conference that had been called at the last minute. Ethan felt the weight of the moment on his shoulders. He looked at Maggie, who stood beside him, strong and resolute. "Are you sure about this?" he asked one last time. Maggie nodded, squeezing his hand. "Absolutely. It's time for the truth to come out." They entered the conference room, which was packed with journalists, executives, and, to Ethan's surprise, his father, Theodore Blackwood, sitting in the front row with an expression of barely contained fury. Ethan approached the podium, his heart pounding in his chest. He looked out at the crowd, saw the anxious faces, the ready cameras, and then he began to speak. "Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for coming. We are here today to reveal a truth that has been buried for decades, a truth about corruption, greed, and lives destroyed in the name of profit." As Ethan spoke, detailing the evidence they had uncovered, a stunned silence fell over the room. He exposed the financial manipulations, the bribes, the ruined lives, and then came the crucial moment. "But the most shocking thing of all," Ethan said, his voice trembling slightly, "is that this conspiracy was orchestrated not only by my father, Theodore Blackwood, but also by one of the most respected men in our industry, Robert Sinclair." A shocked murmur ran through the room. Theodore Blackwood stood up abruptly, his face red with anger. "This is absurd. You have no proof." It was then that Maggie stepped forward. "But we do," she said, her voice firm and clear. "And I am living proof of the consequences of your actions." She began to tell her story, her voice gaining strength as she spoke. She told of her meteoric rise in the corporate world, how she had discovered wrongdoing, and how she had been silenced and destroyed by those she trusted most. As Maggie spoke, Ethan watched the audience's reactions. He saw shock, disbelief, and, finally, understanding spread across the faces around him. He saw his father sink into his chair, arrogance giving way to despair. And then, in the most dramatic moment of the press conference, the doors of the room opened. Robert Sinclair walked in, escorted by federal agents. His normally impassive face was pale and defeated. "It's true," Sinclair said, his voice hoarse. "Everything they said is true." Chaos erupted in the room. Journalists shouted questions. Cameras flashed frantically. Theodore Blackwood tried to run away, only to be stopped by more agents entering the room. In the midst of the confusion, Ethan met Maggie's eyes. He saw in them a mixture of relief, sadness, and above all, hope. He held out his hand and she took it, their fingers intertwining. Hours later, when the dust began to settle, Ethan and Maggie found themselves alone on the roof of the Blackwood building. The sun was setting over the city, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink. "It's over," Maggie said softly, her voice charged with emotion. "It really is over." Ethan pulled her close, wrapping her in a tight hug. "No, my love," he murmured against her hair. "It's just beginning." They stood there, embracing as day gave way to night. Below them, the city pulsed with life, oblivious to the revolution that had just taken place in its corporate bowels. "What do we do now?" Maggie asked, looking at Ethan. He smiled, a smile full of promise and possibility. "Now we rebuild, not just our lives, but the company. We're going to turn it into something we can be proud of, something that really makes a difference in the world." Maggie felt her heart fill with love and admiration for this man who had risked everything for truth and justice. "Together?" she asked, a smile playing on her lips. "Together," Ethan confirmed, leaning down to kiss her softly. As the first stars began to dot Manhattan's night sky, Ethan and Maggie stood there, entwined, their hearts beating in unison. They had faced the worst the corporate world could offer and emerged stronger, more united. The road ahead would be difficult, full of challenges and obstacles. But now they had each other and the certainty that, together, they could overcome anything. And so, standing on top of the world they had helped to change, Ethan and Maggie looked to the future with renewed hope. A future that, although uncertain, promised to be bright, full of love, purpose, and the chance to make a difference. Night fell over New York, enveloping the city in its dark cloak. But for Ethan and Maggie, it was the dawn of a new era, an era of truth, integrity, and true love. And they were ready to face it, side by side, hand in hand, hearts united in one purpose. The end of one story, the beginning of another. The journey continued, more exciting and promising than ever. If you enjoyed this story, I invite you to like and subscribe to my channel. Your support motivates me to keep sharing exciting stories nearly every day. Don't miss the next amazing story that's about to unfold on your screen. I greatly appreciate your backing. Hope to see